everyone. For those who don't know, my name's Megan. I'm a PhD student with the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research. And today I'm going to be presenting on some research we did with parents and carers on their alcohol consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get started, on behalf of the Trobe University, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all gathered today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their living culture and their unique role in the life of this region, and in doing so acknowledge all elders past and present. So this is a little bit broader than my PhD topic, which is on what young kids know about alcohol. And I mean, we all lived and breathed COVID, so we all know a lot about it, but there's a little bit of academic research that has come out, which I thought would be useful to kind of highlight before we get started. So Sarah Callanan from CAPR has led a team of researchers who found that harmful drinking actually decreased overall during the early stages of the pandemic. They did actually find a small increase in consumption for middle-aged women, and they also found that those experiencing high levels of stress during the pandemic were more likely to report an increase in harmful consumption. Importantly for this body of research, they found that parents with dependent children were more likely to report an increase in consumption. And this has also been supported by some other Australian research that found that parents' alcohol consumption actually significantly increased compared to pre-pandemic levels. The Australian Drug Foundation also released a report late last year that found that parents of 9 to 12-year-olds were experiencing the biggest increase in drinking. And that actually 23% of parents of 9 to 12-year-olds reported consuming alcohol in front of their child at least every other day. So there's quite a significant and ever-growing body of quantitative research, but what we need is some more qualitative work to actually situate and contextualise this body of research. And that was our aim. We wanted to explore parents and carers of young children, their experiences of alcohol during the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia. And so we interviewed 30 participants from across nearly all states and territories. Unfortunately, no one from the Northern Territory agreed to participate in an interview. You can see there that we did have a majority of participants from Victoria. We were doing our interviews during the second lockdown. And once we kind of gained some insight into what was going on in the other states and territories where things were returning to COVID normal, we decided we really wanted to hone in on that Victorian experience. To participate, the parents and carers needed to have at least one child or dependent between 4 and 12 years old, and our participants were between 27 and 55 years. So for our analysis, we decided to use a family practices approach to explore the ways in which parents and carers considered their alcohol practices as entangled with or affected by their family dynamics and their role as carers. And the family practices approach kind of sits within those broader practice theories that have increasingly been used to examine drinking alcohol. And practice theories operate on the assumption that by examining everyday practices, the broader social and cultural structures that frame actions can be better understood. And the family practices approach in particular really emphasises the doing of families and the importance of examining the everyday practices and routines of those families. And that's as a way of understanding the structures and collectivities that shape interactions, experiences, and relationships. So jumping into the results, the first thing we really wanted to look at was alcohol consumption prior to and during the COVID pandemic. And when we asked about the initial countrywide lockdown in March and April, many participants described increasing their consumption, most commonly through increasing the frequency. You can see that in the first quote there. This participant says, "I think it's become more predictable, as in I will have 2 glasses 5 days a week." But what we found and what was common in participants' experiences was that this was not a way of drinking that they had really experienced for many ever before, but for a lot since kind of kids came into their life, as you can see in that second quote. What I found particularly interesting was that, and this was particularly for those participants outside of Victoria where things had started to return to some sort of COVID normal, was that their consumption practices actually reverted back or went back to those kind of pre-pandemic levels. So as the third participant says, but then when quarantine finished, I did go back to not having it every night. As we all know, the lockdown experience was very varied, and we found that in our results as well. But an inevitable implication for many participants was a change in space and relations within space. We also saw how behavioural boundaries had changed alongside those more physical changes, such as having, computers and having to find desk space in the home. Alcohol as a shared adult moment or as a form of personal self-care was noted by participants to be particularly important when their spatial boundaries have been blurred. And alcohol was also described as being used in the absence of those usual markers or kind of demarcations signifying the end of the day. So for example, when participants no longer had that commute from workplace to home, and particularly when alcohol was used by participants to facilitate relaxation, alcohol really had a role in shifting from the work portion of the day to the more relaxation or, family time portion of the day. And you can see that in the first quote from the woman in New South Wales. She said, "So I was kind of going, it's 5 o'clock. Well, that's good. The day's over. And here's how I'm going to signal the day is over, because I'm going to have a glass of wine." We also found that parental practices, which could be usually separated, or at least to some extent, from work obligations, became entangled with work practices. The two overlapped to the extent that participants described feeling unable to meet the standards they usually held themselves to or achieved in either their work or personal life. And it was these practices and experiences which built up and contributed to the feelings of stress, which many participants cited as behind their alcohol consumption. Finally, the inability to leave home except for those couple of essential reasons during the strictest period of the lockdown, and the absence of any kind of social or alternative activities for both the participants and their children, was described by some to mean life had become rather boring. And you can see that in the final quote there, which says, "If you'd asked me during quarantine, what do I look forward to? What's the best part of my day during quarantine? I would probably have said opening a bowl of wine at 5 o'clock because it was different." The final results I want to touch on in this quick little presentation is about care and emotional responsibility. So we found that alcohol was discussed for some as a tool to manage their stresses, as we've kind of hinted on, but other participants' discussions, in their discussions, alcohol was found to really contribute to the emotional experience of stress rather than acting as a solution. And I think this comes through in the first quote from this woman from Queensland. She says, "I would hit about 4 o'clock and her daughter would be going mental. She's been home all day and she's just being a nut job. Then I would start looking forward to a glass of wine. I would get anxious if I didn't have it in the house. I'd be like, I need to get some wine. Then I would open it at 5 o'clock on the dot usually." So participants described using alcohol's intoxicant and disinhibitory effects to become desensitized to some of the pressures and stresses of the day, but acknowledged that in this way alcohol had become a bit of a crutch. Without the normal stress relieving outlets to turn to, so for example, gyms, lunch with a friend, even time alone, alcohol had become a bit of a substitute for some participants and was described as one of the only adult pleasures left available to them. Furthermore, for some, alcohol was described as a reward or marker of success and survival in a time when everything felt really scary and uncertain. Many participants did acknowledge that both why they consumed alcohol and the amount that they were drinking was not ideal, but with everything going on, they just didn't see an alternative. As a result, what may once have been used as part of social occasions or for enjoyment was, at least during COVID, discussed by participants to have become a means of coping and surviving. And I think that comes through a little bit in this last quote here. The woman from South Australia says, I think before I used to just drink for fun. I like the taste of alcohol. I like it with food. I enjoy it. I drank for enjoyment. Then there was a point there during COVID where I was like, oh, I need a drink. That's what I thought in my head. I just need a wine. I've had such a bad day. So that's a really quick run through of some of the results from this first paper that we're working on. It's just a couple of conclusions and takeaways to kind of think about. What we saw was that participants were increasing the frequency of their consumption. That was much more common than actually increasing the quantity of their consumption. And we really saw that there was a change in the patterns of their consumption during COVID. Participants really attributed this to the broader family practices, particularly the tensions in space, relationality, stress, and emotional well-being during COVID. I think it's a really important takeaway from this is that even though drinking may have increased for some due to more available time in the absence of other activities and increased stress, participants' accounts show how it may have actually helped them get through the pandemic. And of course, this is, only the experiences of 30 parents and carers, but at least from their discussions, they didn't seem to highlight any repercussions for them and their families. I think moving forward, we need to be careful to avoid shame and really acknowledge the complexity of experience in any future research and in any kind of policy or advocacy that might come out of these experiences during COVID, particularly because the participants in this study really expressed feelings of guilt and demonstrated awareness of harms from consumption. They knew what they were doing was not ideal, but they didn't see any other alternative. I think another important takeaway from this research is that many participants reported that their consumption returned to normal once the lockdown restrictions in their state ended. Of course, whether and how these drinking patterns changed longer term, especially for those who remained in lockdown longer, particularly those in Victoria, of course, remains to be seen, and it's definitely something that we should look into in future research. Of course, these are just my observations and musings, and I'd be super interested to know what others think about this work, but also about the broader COVID-19 body of work that's coming forward, whether this work can actually contribute to policy discussions in the future, I think is something to consider, because although we're sick of hearing it, it was a really unique period in history. And so it's interesting to consider what lessons we may learn from it. Just a little bit of a plug of my own research. There was a second portion of these interviews which looked at children's awareness of alcohol and whether there was any changes to this awareness as a result of the changes in exposure as a result of COVID. And that's what we're going to look at next. So you can see from this quote that parents believe their children were already quite aware of alcohol pre-COVID. And so we're really going to dig in and see if there were any changes during the pandemic. Just some references, if anyone's interested, I can shoot through those couple of papers that I talked about at the start. And a huge thank you to the broader project team. I think most people at CAPR helped out in some form along the way. And there was a group of students who helped out with the interviews as well. So a huge shout out to them too. And that's me done. If anyone has any comments or thoughts or questions, jump on in and let me know.
Claire, do you want to jump in? I know you've got your...
Thanks, everyone.
Is my video showing? I can't.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, I can't see myself. That was really great. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. We've done, in the middle of analysing qualitative interviews from just New South Wales, and so much resonates with the findings you're pulling out and what we're finding. I think we had a very small sample. We didn't recruit just to look at parents. So we have little insight, I guess, of that sample. So I was interested with some of your findings. I think, so I had two questions. We're finding a lot of people kind of self-stigmatise drinking at home, like, I'm now drinking at home and that's a bit sad, or make comments about it being a little bit sad that they're drinking at home. So this might, I was wondering if you had comments about drinking in front of kids, but then I think you were saying that might be the secondary study. So we had a lot of people commenting that it's just sad to drink at home. It's not great to drink at home. So that drinking is really an accepted social practice, but not something, you know, if you do it by yourself, it's more related to addiction or problems, or if you do it at home, even if you're with a couple or a partner, it's a more problematic behaviour, less acceptable. So I wondered if you were finding people talking about being around kids as being problematic. That might be another study. The second question was, you mentioned it was interesting that people noted they were returning to pre-pandemic drinking behaviours. And I wondered if your study might be able to differentiate what are some of the forces on that, being kids going back to school, or some of those structures around children returning versus structures around the adult. So yeah, returning to work, or going out, returning alternative activities, going back to the gym. So differentiating between, yeah.
I think that's a fantastic point. I think that would be something that we maybe look to unpack in that second paper a little bit more, because we do look at, we ask some questions around, do you think your children influence your drinking practices? And I think most of the participants said absolutely they do. So it would be interesting to unpack that there, because you're right, participants really did talk about the kind of their own, things that were happening in their own life that really impact those changes. So, being able to go back to the gym, having other stress relieving outlets that they could engage in, and, going back out with friends, those sorts of things really helped. In terms of the home, participants definitely did talk about drinking in the home in terms of children not being ideal, and just in terms of that's increased their exposure. It's an inevitable implication that we're now drinking at home, and so they're seeing alcohol in a way that they wouldn't have seen it before. But I think we saw the same stigmatizing that you were talking about. That may have just been the questions that we asked, but yeah, that didn't come through in the same way that it has by the sounds from your study. I know Rob has done research. I don't know if she's on it all, but she has done some research more with people in terms of their work status, so people who may have lost work, not just parents and carers, a bit more broadly. So that might have come through a bit more in her interviews. But yeah, not as much for parents and carers. I'm super interested to see your stuff.
Yeah, it'd be great to talk more.
Absolutely, okay. We definitely should.
Thank you.
Megan, we've got a question in the chat as well. So was there a difference between experiences reported by people working from home versus those who still left home for work during lockdowns and didn't want that signal that their day's work has finished?
That was probably a bit of a limitation of our sample, unfortunately. We had 3 participants who lost work. And then the rest all just shifted to working from home. So we really weren't able to capture that, unfortunately. And yeah, most people talked about those ideas of, the bodily density and everyone being at home all the time, and having to find creative ways to be the need for everyone to have their own space, for people to be able to do their work, and people to be able to do their schooling, and, to have then separate space to be able to engage in relaxation and things as well. But yeah, differences in terms of work was just not something we could capture, unfortunately.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go on, Marie.
Hi, Megan. That's great. It's really lovely to hear all of it, see it all come together, and you do it so well. I just wondered, was there any sense that there were influences, like external influences, like marketing influences or advertising? Were people being encouraged to drink by any external sort of forces, like the particular in the industry or somewhere places like that?
The main thing that came through was Facebook, so social media platforms and memes. People talked about the mummy drinking memes and, posts on Facebook, and how they really felt that was enabling. It wasn't, they really didn't think that was a good thing. But that was the main thing that came through. Most didn't talk about advertising in any way. That didn't come through. again, not something we kind of explicitly asked about either, so that could be something.
Claire, do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about gender. So can you just remind me, so it was a sample of 30, was it men and women?
It was 17 women. So we tried hard to get an even sample, but yeah, did end up with a few more women. I did notice before when I ran through my presentation that all my quotes were from women, which is not an accurate representation of what the experiences were. I think the main gender difference we found was that female participants were more likely to talk about emotion work. So, you know, having to manage people's emotions, manage stress, manage anxiety, that came through a lot more for the female participants than the male participants. But otherwise, experiences seem to be, you know, the same across the board for both genders.
We've got a few more minutes, so feel free to yell out or raise your hand or put something in the chat, and Megan will take the questions.
I'd just add to Anne-Marie's comment, I don't know if anyone knows if anyone's doing any work around advertising alcohol during COVID. I think that would be interesting to do an analysis of marketing campaigns and how they were framed, who they were targeting.
Was there some stuff, I think early on in the pandemic, the group in WA did a report on that, on alcohol advertising. I think it was a content analysis from memory.
Okay.
I might be dobbing the wrong person in, but was it Hannah Pierce who might have done that work?
I'll have a look, okay.
Yeah. But I think it would be interesting to do something more long-term or follow up on what they've done.
Space is also coming out in ours, and it would be really interesting to also see how that affects families who are in homes versus apartments and, yeah, personal space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was one participant who talked about how they got a caravan and set that up in the backyard so that, you know, he could have his workspace while his wife worked in the bedroom, while their kids were working in the living room. You know, people had to get quite creative to be able to account for everyone's needs. But it was really interesting then how that intersected with stress, because things that may once have been acceptable in the house, you know, noise and laughter and, you know, those sort of things became unacceptable because, you know, what the space needed to account for. And that was really interesting to see.
Megan, I've got one. Do you have any insights about, do you think it was temporary while people were working from home that they felt that stress and they'll go back to sort of relatively normal, or do you think it's something that will continue on?
Not all the types of stress, if that makes sense. I think there were some stresses that were particularly unique to COVID, but we definitely saw that parents had stress beforehand. You know, their lives weren't stress-free and they were already drinking or talking about drinking to manage that stress. Everything just got considerably heightened during COVID, and potentially there were new stresses. But I think that is a general takeaway from this body of research, that, you know, the way parents experience stress is very different, and how that intersects with their alcohol consumption as well. I think that's something that, you know, is not specific to COVID, if that makes sense.
Hey Megan, great presentation.
Thanks,
as you know, I've sort of like done some of the interviews as part of the COVID stuff. I was interested in what you thought about what this might mean, especially for parents who are going to continue working from home into the future, especially if you're thinking of parents using alcohol as kind of this symbolic boundary kind of for the end of the day, what does it mean for kind of a workforce and for parents who are more likely to work from home going forward?
That's really interesting to consider, because I think if you are working from home, I think that was definitely something that impacted those participants outside of Victoria who did revert back, was that they were going back to normal life. You know, it was a COVID normal, sure, but they were, you know, back going out, they were back able to go to the gym, they were back, you know, the kids were back at school. So I think, yeah, moving forward, if working from home does become the norm, I think there might be implications for alcohol consumption. Yeah, obviously something we would need to follow up for sure, but then again, you know, if the kids are back at school and they're still able to go to the gym, you know, maybe not. I don't know, that's not something I considered, Gabe, as you can tell with my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I was just sort of musing.
Yeah,
something to think about. Yeah,
absolutely. Because it was very much that idea that I've got nothing left. Like, alcohol is all I have got left. It's the only adult pleasure. I can't go out with my friends. I can't, you know, go to. Remember, one participant really talked about how she just didn't have any time alone. She was never alone. And she was a stay-at-home mum before, so she was used to having, you know, 6 to 8 hours alone. And she'd gone to being 24/7 surrounded by people, and that was such a shock and a change. And then, yeah, without being able to go to the gym or, you know, lunch with a friend, the alcohol was all she felt she had left. So if other things come back into the life, other ways of dealing with stress, then maybe it won't stay. But yeah, that's just my first random thoughts, Gabe. Something to definitely think about more.
Cool, thank you.
Can I just also really
Please.
quickly add to Gabe, and you picked up with routine, like without the work structures, you know, the time when it's acceptable to drink changes a little bit. In our study, we're finding people, like one of the changes people report with their consumption is they're drinking later at night because a hangover in the morning or sleeping in the morning is not a detriment to starting work because of working at home. So there may be differences in drinking practices like that, like drinking later into the night if adults continue working at home a couple of days a week. You know, it may be that big drinking nights might not be like Thursday, Friday, Saturday anymore. There might be a bit more dispersion through days of the week.
Yeah. I found drinking earlier with the participants, not dramatic, but maybe going from, you know, having a drink with dinner at 6 o'clock to having a drink at 5 or 4:30, you know. So it was those sort of changes in timing for these participants.
That's probably Amy here. That's probably because they still had the kids in the morning, so they couldn't sleep in.
Yes.
Drinking later. Kids and a hangover, not fun.
Sure.
Megan, we're just on 12:30, so was there any final comments you wanted to make before we wrap up?
No, thanks everyone for coming. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Megan. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a good day, everyone.
Well done, Megan. That was great.
Thanks, Amy.